Humans of the cardboard, welcome back to Just Nuts, guys. Today we are doing a discussion about Traptrix. Where are they in the current game, and just kind of their general spot, how they stand competitively versus the rest of the format, and go from there. The structure deck is really nice. One, it has good reprints in it and good generic cards, but also the 8 new cards are wondrous for the archetype. I think the only one that I would say is like subpar to me, or at least not unplayable completely, but like not advisable, is the draw spell. Outside of that, I felt like every new card was like really, really nice for the deck. So yeah, where does the deck land? I think all in all, I think it's actually in a pretty good spot. I think it's actually quite a strong rogue deck in the current format and probably for a while to come. This deck has a ton of really strong points to it, a couple of weak points, but yeah. The strong points are definitely going first. Going first, the deck seems really, really nice. Not only is it consistent, but it's one of the problems the deck used to have was like if you want to do any sort of combo with Traptrix, you would have had to have opened a Traptrix monster plus either Shade Brigandine or Parallel Exceed. And even if you opened Parallel Exceed, you weren't really doing a ton. You were just summoning. You were just making a rank 4 under Sarah. And then playing like Sarah control, playing your trap control, and go from there. Well, now the deck's so much more consistent. The fact that Sarah turn 1 can set Holusha, and it's activatable if you have a trap in hand. The fact that Mermelio legitimately searches you Holusha as an amazing extender card to make your turn 1 play so much more explosive and consistent. Your engine is getting you to these plays, not just praying that you open either Parallel Exceed or Shade Brigandine. So I love it. On top of that, the deck is not as weak to its old weaknesses or weaknesses you would generally pair with a deck that, like similar to Traptrix, where this deck doesn't really have many spells. Really, the only spell you'd play is like the field spell, at least in Archetype. Maybe you'd play Prosperity or something, but aside from that, you're not really playing spells, and so you're a deck that's going to set multiple back row. Maybe you have 1 to 3 monsters on field. That's generally a deck that is super susceptible to a couple things. Back row removal, but specifically more so like evenly matched and stuff. This deck, this version with the new cards is so much better at not necessarily playing around that. Evenly is evenly, and we don't necessarily end on Omni Negates in the deck all too often, but if you end on Redoer, he can tag out. Cool, you're getting him back, that's value later on. Even if an Exceed monster is banished face down, if it had Holusha as material, which it normally does with your end boards, Holusha can reborn something like a Pudica or a Mermelio or a Dionea to either get you follow-up or removal on your opponent's turn and guarantee you a Traptrix body into the next turn. Value there. And, on top of that, like if you keep Sarah can just summon from deck and continue to get you value there. So the deck is not nearly as susceptible as it used to be to stuff like evenly matched. I try to refrain from playing a ton of back row cards aside from like the stuff you have to play, the trap holes and whatnot, because if you play too many, you do make your deck a little more weak to those. But I think most builds are kind of built in a pretty good way where you're not getting decimated by those cards, which even stuff like Evenly is seeing play in the main deck right now. So I love that. And I think the last thing that I want to really, really hone in on that I kind of noticed with Tier, and I think this is what made Tier so good, and it kind of goes into that point of like, we don't just lose to evenly matched, is when Tier was so good, the reason I think Tier was so good was it wasn't weak to any one card. It wasn't like decimated by any one card. I mean, Shifter is Shifter. That was the one thing. But as far as like generic anti, strategies for the deck, the reason I think the deck was so good was because you ended with Monster Interruption on the board, right? Like a Roll Callous or something. You ended with a set Solic, at least a set Solic, right? You'd end with an Ishizu Shuffler, right, or something, or a way to like pitch, send one of the names from like to grave to trigger it on the opponent's turn. And you also usually had like Havness. Maybe you could also have a Kelbeck in hand. it just, you had a way to play in like every facet of the game, and it made it so hard to like counter the deck because it just had so much going on in so many different areas. So even if you did evenly match them, they could still keep the rule Kalos, banish everything else. They could still have a Havness and maybe a Kelbeck in hand, and they might have 1 or 2 cards engraved that can trigger on your turn as well for interruption. Also throw in Bistils as more things that can activate in hand. This deck has a little bit of that. I would say the one thing it doesn't do a ton of is play from hand. You have Arachnocampa, which protects the back row, which again, I didn't mention that earlier, but as far as weaknesses for the deck, Arachnocampa also is a really nice tool to make sure we're not getting blown out by Harpy's Feather Duster, Lightning Storm, stuff like that on your back row. Not that the back row is like the end-all be-all for the deck, but it certainly could come up to save you a couple of, 2 to 3 cards, potentially, so that's nice. But yeah, it's really the only card that's playing from hand, and even though it technically is playing on the opponent's turn, it's not really providing you like an interruption or anything per se, but it is still a nice card. But Holusha being able to like do its thing in Grave. Holusha, by the way, in my opinion, is by far the most important card we got out of this structure deck. Putica is probably the second best card. Then you can argue about the rest, but those two to me, so nice for the deck. They really, Holusha is the game plan. Just Holusha after Holusha after Holusha. It allows you to grind. It allows you to not only generate multiple bodies by summoning it when you have Sarah on field, but then also getting you a revive on a later turn and as a quick effect is insane. It's really quite insane. So the deck grinds as well, and that's awesome. Yeah, I think it has that similar facet that Tyr did, where it plays from Grave. It plays with monsters on field. You can end on like Redoer with a trap plus Rafflesia. You could end on plus like 1 or 2 back row. Sarah's doing her own thing, mainly helping you grind, but that makes it really annoying because your opponent's more worried about not getting decimated by interruption, but the whole time you're also just going to plus like a shit ton off of Sarah, and then also Holusha doing its thing in Grave. It's great. It really is. So I think it has that facet. It makes it harder for other decks to kind of counter because you have just multiple things going on in different areas of the game state, which is great. Last thing I want to point out here, or at least like the last main thing I want to focus on here, is meta matchups, right? Because this matters when you're talking about how good a deck is in the format. If you're talking about the best deck in the game, this is the deck's best matchup, is Kashtira. The deck actually has a really good Kashtira matchup. Floodgate Trap Hole is probably your main number 1 trap hole, and versus Cash, it is great. It's really good because booking their first monster means they probably have to have at least 2 to 3 cards to play through that, and half the time they just won't. So really, really powerful versus them. And sometimes even like setting your stuff into a board isn't even half bad either. Their interruptions don't always play cleanly into the way that your deck plays, so that's very nice as well. If you can get into a Zeus line, Zeus is very good versus the deck, and this deck can actually facilitate Zeus somewhat decently. From there, Labyrinth. I also tend to feel like this isn't the worst matchup in the world. I could see a scenario where if you lose the die roll and you're going second, I think it can be tough, because just if they can just keep you from putting any Traptrix monsters really on the field, obviously that's always going to be brutal. But I will say this: once you get any of your extra deck Traptrix monsters on field, they are all unaffected by trap effects. So all of these removal traps are doing nothing to you. So you definitely have to keep that in mind, because if you can just get to Sarah and then just start resolving Sarah and Holusha multiple times, and just summon Myrmelio from deck, pop a card, pop a back row, summon Myrmelio from grave on the opponent's turn, pop a card, just continually just go pop, eventually you can run them out of advantage. Lady Labyrinth is annoying, because we don't always have the best counters to it if we don't already have our trap holes set up, but I do think it's actually not that bad of a matchup. You just have to learn how to play it, and if you can play defensively and then eventually establish an unaffected by Traptrix monster, you could actually be in a really good position. From there, we have Branded, Despia, whatever you want to call it. I actually don't think this is a terrible matchup either. Going second's definitely tough. I mean, we have evenly and stuff like that, but obviously, going second is just tough. It's the biggest weakness of the deck, is for sure just straight up going second. You want to play somewhere between 5 and 8 max trap holes, and doing that, trap holes are not always the greatest cards going second, because into an established board, they're usually not finding triggers unless your opponent tries to extend from there. which is tough because sometimes they can just go battle phase and give you no way to trigger a trap hole, which is brutal. But yeah, I think it's pretty good versus deck. I like that there's so many trap holes that work so slightly differently in a lot of different in a lot of ways that it kind of gives you a trap hole for like almost any matchup. Like there should be a trap hole that's really good at a specific, choke, we'll call it a choke point, or just a specific point versus almost any deck. And there's stuff like Time, Space, and Bottomless that are actually quite good versus the branded deck. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a great matchup. It's definitely a die roll-y kind of matchup, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's like auto lose. So I think it's kind of somewhere in the middle, which is fine. Plus, Pingucula's effect is actually quite good against this deck to steal Albaz's Engrave as they're trying to fuse. From there, Sprite. I would say Sprite's just one of those decks that I would expect to see somewhat regularly this format, whether you think it's legitimately good or not. It's seeing some representation. I think our deck is generally bigger than a lot of the Sprite monsters, so that's already a bonus. That makes it kind of tough for them to kind of like crack through our boards. Plus, something like Floodgate Trap Hole on their normal summon can be quite brutal because it puts them on have starter or kind of just be stuck if they don't have a way to have a level 2 on field. And yeah, I actually think this is one of the better matchups overall because Sprite boards have they're not that great anymore. One hand trap, one board breaker seems to really kind of be a bigger nuisance than it used to be. And yeah, I think that's kind of tough for them to deal with, but it works. So I think that's actually an in favor matchup overall. The deck can grind, but like so can ours. We would just rotate Holusha a ton. And the last one is Runic. Runic may be one of the tougher matchups out there just because our best way to deal with Fountain is Myrmelio. And of course, if you've ever played against Runic, you would know that they're able to just like churn out a way to protect their Fountain from destruction specifically, like over and over and over again. So it kind of makes it tough. If they get established and they just get that draw loop going, you're probably just screwed. I mean, it's just the sad fact of it, especially if they're banishing some of your cards off the top of your deck for the grind that you might need. It definitely can be pretty tough. So I would say this is the one, be really careful matchup, but I do think the rest are actually super manageable, somewhere between decent to like really good. Like I think Kashtira is like, I don't want to say the buy, but I do think the deck handles it very, very well relative to a lot of other rogue decks. So yeah, that's kind of where I land. I just wanted to do a general discussion. I did my profile a couple days ago. You guys seem pretty hyped about that, but I didn't necessarily talk about where I actually think the deck lines up. I do think this is actually quite a strong rogue pick going forward. I think it's just one of those trap decks that like also just weirdly enough plays enough turn 1. It's not just set 4 anymore. It's like you're legitimately setting up lines. You can go into different rank 4s that you want for different scenarios, different matchups. You can access different trap holes for whatever matchup you want via stuff like Rafflesia, or once you know what they're playing, you're just choosing what you want to set. It's actually quite good, and it has enough flexibility as a trap deck to kind of adjust. A lot of trap decks in the past were just kind of draw your hand, set your 4 cards, summon your 1 engine monster, and pass from there. But now this is like such a cool hybrid variant, I really think. It's really, really cool. So if you're interested, there you go. I mean, I really think it's playable. I think it's a top rogue option. I mean, there's an argument that it could potentially borderline like top 5 contender in the format. Now, I'm not necessarily going to go there. I do think it's definitely there for like top 10 contender argument, but we'll see. We'll see if enough people pick it up. It's going to be super budget, super easy to pick up and go, because the structure deck already gives you like 75% of everything you would be playing like for the entire deck anyway. It's really, really solid. But yeah, that's it for me here, guys. Thank you so much for watching as always. Let me know your thoughts down below. Do you agree, disagree with any of the stuff I said here? Throw in any extra points about Traptrix, or just your general thoughts about Traptrix and the way they're placed in the metagame going forward. I'd love to hear it there. But I'm out of here for today. Thank you so much for watching as always. Subscribe if you have not yet and you want to see more stuff from me down the line. Peace.